My dear, next week I arrive, not just to marry, but to heal the wounds we never spoke of. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the weight of every silent prayer I whispered for us. In 1 week, our souls will collide like stars finally knowing their destined dance. Next week, I bring all my broken pieces to build a love that never shatters again. This isn't just a wedding, it's a sacred promise carved from the scars we both hide. I'm coming to marry you next week. The universe finally said yes to our chaos. The silence between us is about to scream our forever next week. Next week, I'll wear your name like a prayer tattooed on my heart. I'm coming with a heart bruised but brave, ready to marry the soul I fought for. Next week, we'll rewrite the story of love that nearly broke us but never left us. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying all the regrets to leave them behind. Next week, love will no longer be a question, but a sacred answer on our lips. I'm crossing every ocean of doubt to marry you next week, fearless and undone. Next week, I promise to hold your silence as fiercely as your laughter. I'm coming to marry you next week, with the scars that only true love understands. 1 week until our souls marry, raw, wild, and hauntingly real. Next week, I'll kneel not just in love, but in reverence of your entire being. I'm coming to marry you next week, bringing the storm and the calm in one breath. Next week, our past pain will bow down to the altar of new beginnings. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to be both your sanctuary and your wildfire. Next week, every broken promise becomes a sacred vow between us. I'm coming with trembling hands and an unshakable heart, ready to say yes to forever. Next week, I'll marry not just you, but the infinite love we never knew we deserved. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the echoes of every whispered maybe. Next week, our shadows and light merge into one fearless flame. I'm coming to marry you next week, even though I'm terrified to lose myself in you. Next week, I'll wear your love like armor against every ghost of heartbreak. I'm coming to marry you next week, with all the silent tears turned into promises. Next week, the world will witness the sacred madness of our love. I'm coming to marry you next week, bearing the wild hope of every shattered dream. Next week, love will drown the doubts we once thought impossible to forget. I'm coming to marry you next week, fear and faith entwined in my trembling heart. Next week, I vow to hold your soul as tenderly as the stars hold the night. I'm coming to marry you next week, bearing the weight of every untold story between us. Next week, every scar you carry will be honored in our sacred union. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to finally belong to the chaos we created. Next week, our love will shatter silence like thunder breaking dawn. I'm coming to marry you next week, with a heart cracked open, waiting to heal. Next week, every heartbeat will chant the name we never dared to say aloud. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying a lifetime of what ifs finally answered. Next week, I'll hold your hand like it's the last promise I'll ever need. I'm coming to marry you next week, a wild soul finally tethered by sacred love. Next week, love will rewrite the wounds into poetry only we understand. I'm coming to marry you next week, bearing the sacred weight of our unfinished dreams. Next week, I'll whisper your name like a prayer finally answered in the dark. I'm coming to marry you next week, afraid, hopeful, and utterly undone by love. Next week, every doubt dissolves into the sacred fire of our joining. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying all the love we buried in silence. Next week, I vow to love you without conditions, without fear, without end. I'm coming to marry you next week, holding your brokenness like fragile light. Next week, the universe will witness a love both terrifying and transcendent. I'm coming to marry you next week with trembling faith and a fierce heart. Next week, every secret we hid will be honored in our sacred vow. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the ghosts of every almost between us. Next week, love will be the only language our hearts speak. I'm coming to marry you next week, bringing the storm and the calm wrapped in one. Next week, every tear we shed will water the roots of our forever. I'm coming to marry you next week, with a heart wide open and fiercely hopeful. Next week, I vow to hold your soul gently, fiercely, eternally. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to love all your light and shadows. Next week, the silence between us will sing our truth loudly. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the wild hope of new beginnings. Next week, I'll wear your love like a sacred flame against the dark. I'm coming to marry you next week, with every fear burned away by any fierce desire. Next week, our hearts will merge into a universe of their own making. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the weight of every sacred promise. Next week, love will be the quiet rebellion against all our past pain. I'm coming to marry you next week, afraid but ready to become your forever. Next week, I'll carry your soul like the rarest gift in my trembling hands. I'm coming to marry you next week with a heart cracked open by love's fire. Next week, our love will be a wild, sacred song no one else can hear. I'm coming to marry you next week, bringing every broken piece to make us whole. Next week, I vow to love you beyond all fears and all regrets. I'm coming to marry you next week with trembling faith in our endless tomorrow. Next week, every whispered doubt will dissolve in the fire of our vows. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the sacred madness of our love. Next week, our souls will finally collide in fierce, fearless devotion. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to love the darkness and light within you. Next week, love will be our rebellion, our salvation, our forever. If this touched your soul, don't scroll, like, comment your favorite quote, and subscribe for more. I'm coming to marry you next week, bearing the weight of all our quiet prayers. Next week, every scar you wear becomes a sacred mark of love's endurance. I'm coming to marry you next week, fearful, fierce, and fully undone by love. Next week, I'll carry your soul like a fragile flame in the night. I'm coming to marry you next week with all the wild hope I can muster. Next week, our love will be the quiet roar that shatters silence forever. I'm coming to marry you next week, bearing all the weight of unspoken truths. Next week, every broken promise becomes a vow written in stars. I'm coming to marry you next week with trembling faith and unshakable hope. Next week, our hearts will finally sing the love they've been aching for. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to embrace all your light and shadow. Next week, love will be the only truth we speak. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying the sacred fire of our forever. Next week, I vow to hold your soul gently, fiercely, eternally. I'm coming to marry you next week, with every fear burned away by love's flame. Next week, our souls will collide in sacred, wild devotion. I'm coming to marry you next week, fearful, hopeful, and fiercely alive. Next week, love will be our rebellion against every shadow of doubt. I'm coming to marry you next week, with a heart cracked open by sacred fire. Next week, we become one, wild, free, and unbreakable. Next week, I'll carry your heart like the rarest treasure, fiercely and forever. I'm coming to marry you next week, with love louder than all our fears combined. Next week, the universe will witness our souls entwined beyond time's cruel hands. I'm coming to marry you next week. Bruised, broken, but unbreakably devoted. Next week, love will shatter the silence we once mistook for peace. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying hope stitched into every breath. Next week, our forever begins with trembling hands and fierce hearts. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to heal every wound with sacred love. Next week, every shadow you hide becomes a part of our sacred light. I'm coming to marry you next week, with a heart ready to catch your falling pieces. Next week, the stars will bow to the fire burning between us. I'm coming to marry you next week, holding every unspoken word as a sacred vow. Next week, love will be the language we speak without words. I'm coming to marry you next week, fragile, fierce, and utterly yours. Next week, our souls will rewrite the meaning of forever. I'm coming to marry you next week, bringing a heart both broken and brave. Next week, every tear we shed will water the roots of our love. I'm coming to marry you next week, carrying all the dreams we dared not say. Next week, I'll love you with the wildness of every star in the sky. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to hold your soul in my hands. Next week, every silence between us will sing a new sacred song. I'm coming to marry you next week, with a heart cracked open by hope. Next week, love will be the rebellion that saves us both. I'm coming to marry you next week, scarred, soulful, and ready to heal. Next week, I vow to hold you like the world depends on it. I'm coming to marry you next week, with every broken piece made whole. Next week, the universe will witness love fierce enough to defy fate. I'm coming to marry you next week, trembling but unshakably devoted. Next week, I'll carry your heart like a sacred flame against the dark. I'm coming to marry you next week, ready to transform pain into poetry. Next week, every doubt will dissolve into the fire of our vows.